All right, well, thanks everybody for coming today. My name's Dr. K, founder of Quai Network, and today we're going to be talking about mined transactions. So this is going to be a little bit more in depth. We've gone over mined transactions before, but this will go into the process a little bit deeper with a little bit more math and a little bit more explanation on incentives as we've created a specification and refined our definition of mined transactions. Before we get into it, just want to give a little bit of context for everybody. We're going to have a technical presentation here, but just want to sort of give the context for why we're talking about the technology. So the idea with Quai Network, the goal here is to create a system that can function as money. The requirement to function as money is somewhere on the order of, say, 50,000 transactions per second. To do that, Quai has implemented a multi-chain architecture. So if you look on the left here, we see a traditional sort of first generation blockchain. And then if you look on the right, you'll see a hierarchy of merge mined blockchains that allows us to dynamically increase throughput while maintaining security guarantees that are similar to something like Bitcoin. There are a number of things that Quai is doing to allow us to increase our throughput. We've gone over shards before, we've gone over subnets before. Today we're going over merge mined transactions. Merge mined transactions allow us to do things in both subnets and in terms of streaming processing of blocks that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do without merge mined transactions. But before we get into merge mined transactions, one of the reasons we're doing merge mined transactions is to prevent MEV or miner extracted value. So let's define the mining process real quick and then define miner extracted value. So mining is a process of economically committing to a set of transactions. To do that, a miner has to propose a block first, so that includes ordering the set of transactions in the block and then computing the new proposed state. Once they have a proposed block, they go through the process of trying to find a nonce, which will create a hash that meets a difficulty threshold for that block. And if they meet that threshold, they'll find a valid block. They can broadcast it to the network, and then they do the process all over again. The key here with proof of or a work-based system is that every block is a unique economic commitment, and that expense of that commitment is what creates finality in the blockchain. And a work-based system is really the only way to achieve permissionless consensus, as well as then getting ordering and validity. So it's important to understand that the process of mining is also the process of ordering. And if you look here, right, the first part of that process is when I say organize sets into a new transaction, or organize transactions into a new block, the miners are choosing the order of the transactions that go into the block, and depending on the nature of those transactions, that ordering can be very important. So what does mining actually accomplish? Mining allows the distributed creation of a valid order of transactions. So when we're ordering transactions, if I have a block, I can put TXA before TXB or TXB before TXA. Now, if I do that, that will create two different possible proposed blocks. If they're not interfering transactions, there's no double spends. So those blocks are both technically valid. But the question is then, what block does the network prefer? Do they prefer block A or B? And if we have a consensus mechanism, in this case, we're looking at it from the viewpoint of PoW, we can come up with a weighting of a block, and the network can effectively choose one block over another just by the PoW mechanism of measuring entropy. However, so what this means though, is mining orders the transaction in blocks, and it also orders the blocks in the chain. So everything about a blockchain is about creating order, both on an intra-block basis and an inter-block basis. So what does miner extractable value do? Miner extractable value is when miners make money by altering the order. And the way that they do this, a very simple form, there's multiple forms of this, but front running is the simplest. So in this like very simple case of front running, if someone were to swap ETH for DAI on Uniswap, say that's Alice, and then Bob sees this transaction propagated in the network, but it hasn't been finalized, it hasn't been included in a block. Bob can submit an order that has a higher gas fee than Alice, or a gas price, and then the miners, because they're getting paid by the gas price, will prefer to order Bob's transaction prior to Alice's. Now, with a front-running opportunity like this, Alice's order necessarily will effectively create slip in the exchange. And what Bob is trying to do is Bob is trying to capitalize on the fact that Alice's order is going to cause slip. So Bob effectively front runs Alice's order, buys DAI to ETH at a higher price. He pays that execution fee, but then once he's done that, he can reverse the order against Alice and make money effectively. So MEV takes advantage of the fact that we're using fee-based ordering to profit. So because in this system, the only thing that ordering is determined by is that fee, if someone wants to front run a transaction, once a transaction is announced, all they simply have to do is pay the fee to get the miners to put it in the order that they would like. And then the question, though, is why is MEV bad? MEV creates incentives which compete with block incentives, and this is really sort of the primary reason we're concerned about it at Quai Network. There are secondary reasons which are that it costs the transactors money, and it makes the participation in markets, I don't know if I want to use the word less efficient, but it causes participants to end up paying fees because they're effectively giving other market participants a preview of what they're about to do before it's actually done, which then allows other market participants, in this case MEV operators or MEV bots, to make money off the transactions that people are trying to execute. So, but from Quai Network's perspective, our biggest issue is the influence of MEV on miner behavior. So what we would like to do is we'd like to construct a system which has a dominant strategy incentive compatible outcome. That means that the miners will all cooperate, and they're all cooperating against the same set of incentives, which are defined by the blockchain, the consensus algorithms, and the reward mechanisms. They're not going to modify their behavior because there's some secondary set of incentives that isn't sort of being measured or rewarded in the protocol. Now, the unfortunate part is with MEV, you create a secondary incentive, which means that you can create non-dominant strategy incentive compatible behavior. Another way to put that is the miners won't cooperate with each other. If the miners aren't cooperating based off the incentive design, it means you're going to, at very least, have a less efficient chain. And over time, you could argue that you're potentially, in aggregate, not going to achieve what we call safety and liveness. And safety and liveness add up to security and immutability in a blockchain. Another way you could think about this is the time to finalizing a transaction would necessarily increase. And we can kind of see that with this example. If we go back to sort of our two different proposed blocks where we reorder transaction A and B, if the sort of MEV opportunity to do B instead of A is greater than the mining incentive, the miners won't cooperate. So if a block subsidy is, say, 100 Quai, or there's 100 Quai of fee in a block, but a MEV opportunity is 1,000 Quai. If a miner that's reordering B before A can exploit that 1,000 Quai with even a 10% chance, they will now operate in a non-cooperative manner because they're going to end up making more than they would if they participated in a cooperative manner. And what this is really elucidating is the fact that all fee-based systems are mal-designed. There are effectively two ordering markets in blockchains as they are currently designed. There's a fee ordering market and there's a hash ordering market when we're referring to work-based chains. Now, the fee ordering market is the intra-block ordering, and the hash market is effectively the inter-block ordering. But the important point here is, regardless of it being inter or intra-block, those markets are the same because it's just a market for ordering. So the problem is, how do I have two markets paid in two different quantities to achieve the same sort of good, which is ordering? Because that's ultimately what we care about. So MEV actually arises from the fact that we have two markets. And then the question is there a way that we can get rid of those two markets and consolidate them into a single market? And that's where we get into how do we mitigate MEV. So how to mitigate MEV, and this is just a quick overview, and then we're going to really dive in and get kind of wonky today. So how do we mitigate MEV? Mine transactions create a single ordering market, ideally eliminating MEV. So the big idea here is that we can create effectively what would be considered a fourth level in Quai Network, right? So we have the prime chain, we have the region chains, we have the zone chains. A mine transaction is basically like a fourth level. And so just in the same way that we merge mine zone blocks with region blocks with prime blocks, you could merge mine transactions with zone blocks, region blocks, and prime blocks. And so what a merge mine transaction is it's an alteration of the data structure to allow that merge mining to take place. And then what we'll do is, so if I'm a miner in the system, or I'm a transactor in the system, and say I have a transaction which I am concerned about how it's ordered in a block, what I would like to do is I would like to get it ordered first in the block. So in the construction of merge mine transactions, I'll create my transaction, but it's going to have a reference to what I think the current block is, as well as my transaction data. And then I'm going to mine for both a block and a transaction or a bit share simultaneously. So I'm going to do that mining. And if I get lucky and I hit a block threshold, I'll actually find a block instead of a transaction. Otherwise, what I'll do is I'll find a nonce, or I'll mine until I find a nonce which is greater than sort of the bit share I think I need to get the ordering that I would like in the block. So sort of my threshold for that bit share is going to be related to the value of what I think the MEV opportunity is that exists on my transaction. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to submit that bit share to the miners to include in a block. But they're now, instead of going to be ordering by fee, they're going to be ordering by the weight of that share. So what this has done is it's created a objective mechanism by which we can order transactions in a block, and it's created a temporally expensive mechanism for altering the ordering, or sort of front running the ordering, because of time and delays related to creating bid shares. So a very simple example, if we go back to Bob and Alice, Bob is just able to instantaneously sort of change the fee on a transaction and broadcast it. In the case of a bit share, Bob would now have to form his transaction. He would then have to mine for some period of time until he found something that was better than Alice's. And then only if he found something better and he could propagate it in the network would that be preferenced in a block. And he would have to do that in the time between when Alice's transaction propagates in the network and the next block is found. So now Bob is operating under a very tight window, and he doesn't have certainty that he's going to be able to accomplish that bit share in that time window and get it included. So now every attempt that Bob is making has expense because he has uncertainty in success of his execution. So I'm making it much more expensive for Bob to try to MEV Alice. So the advantages of this concept are a couple things. we can actually start to get what we would call statistical consistency prior to the block being mined, which is a very interesting sort of outcome here, because if I can objectively order blocks and I can make sure that my transactions are pre-propagated, the block proposals of different miners will start to look more and more and more similar as the time since the last block proposed, or since the last valid block was found, to now approaches the mean expectation time of finding the next block. So we'll effectively kind of know what the block is going to be before the block is found, and then you can do cool things with that, like start to sort of pre-compute the block instead of having to wait for the block to be found before you start processing. And that's really a great benefit to throughput. The other thing that it does is that it reduces MEV. So if we look at Bob and Alice again, Bob has a much more expensive and much more uncertain outcome with a mine transaction than he would if he could simply do a higher fee and guarantee success. And then the other thing that it does, it aligns intra and inter block ordering markets, which is the most important thing for Quai Network, because we're most concerned about always maintaining DeSIC compatible behavior of miners such that they will cooperatively extend the tip of the chains, because we have so many chains and so many tips. So mine transactions minimize MEV, and they help create statistical consistency as well as reinforce DeSIC compatible behavior. So then the question is, sort of with that overview, how do we actually execute all of these things in a mathematical way, I guess? So what we're going to do is we need to include the transaction weight with the weight of the block, so that including transactions makes a heavier block. So what this does is it now makes the ability, or the incentive for miners to always include transactions, because if they don't include a transaction, they will be disadvantaged compared to if they did include a transaction. And this is very important, because if there's this secondary MEV incentive, there can be these outside incentives that could cause a miner to want to not include a transaction in a block, because somebody is paying them to sort of withhold it so that they can sort of front run it in the next block. So by including the weight of the transaction in the block, if a miner doesn't do it, they're actually putting themselves at a disadvantage to winning the whole race in the system and getting their block rewards. The other thing that this does for us is the addition of the weights here. So if we look at these two blocks, right, and this is the same example, and we sort of have the same block weight again. So our upper block has an intrinsic delta S of 16, our lower has an intrinsic delta S of 17. We now have this sort of delta STX, right? And with this delta STX, what ends up happening is if we don't include a transaction as we subsequently go forward in sort of a multi-depth fork, your block weights will decrease in weight over time. So when you're creating a merge mine transaction, you have to reference what you think is the most current block. So when you're doing your merge mining, you're actually making a commitment to the chain tip. This is the reason that it makes sense for us to be able to add that weight of that transaction into a block, because that transaction is actually making a worked commitment to the prior block or the block before it. So then when we add that transaction in, we're just sort of adding our commitments together. And there's a process to sort of do that in a statistically fair way. And we'll go over that. But what will end up happening is if a miner is sort of mining a private chain, they won't be getting these bid shares from everybody else in the network that's producing worked transactions. And as those bid shares aren't there because nobody's referencing their block. So in this case, that upper block, we can see the next block that they're working only has 2 sort of bits of entropy to be added, because nobody else is referencing their block when creating merge mine transactions for the next block. However, in the sort of the open network or the honest network that won, people would still be creating merge mine transactions. So, the next block's going to fill. It's going to fill with the total weight of sort of the transactions. And the next block's going to be at an advantage because everybody knew about it. Everybody thought it was the canonical tip, and everybody was referencing it with their merge mine shares. So there's actually a really interesting implication here beyond MEV. But we'll cover that at the end in terms of resilience to attackers with merge mine transactions. But the upshot is for MEV, effectively after one block, if you lose, your expectation value of winning effectively goes to 0 in the subsequent block. So in some cases, if we don't have merge mine transactions and we have very sort of high MEV incentives, even if this upper block was lost, so to speak, there's still an incentive to try for the next block or get lucky for the next block, so to speak, because you might sort of win it on the left side of the Poisson distribution, which would then mean that if your outcome is outsized for the MEV compared to the block reward, even if you have a 10% chance of winning, but your reward is 10 times bigger, you still may choose to non-cooperatively try to find the next block. So you're trying to mine sort of like a private end-depth fork. But by having these mined transaction shares also count towards the block weight, anytime somebody that's doing a private mining is effectively put at a huge disadvantage past a 1 block depth, which means if they lose that block, there's 0 incentive for them to keep trying to get the next block with their preferred ordering. So this is cool. It sounds like mine transactions with including the transactions in the block weight creates a cooperative outcome, but I put cooperative in question marks with MEV in the system. However, well, let's sorry, 1 second. Yeah, so then we're going to talk about the sort of TX weight calculation here and sort of how do we add these shares in fairly. So when we're thinking, this is the equation, and for reference for everybody, if people are interested in looking into this more or actually making comments, there's a PR for a QIP or a QIP that's on GitHub under the Quai Network repo. And people can feel free to go there, review the full sort of technical specification, make comments, recommendations, or dig into sort of any of this math or proposals. It's certainly welcome. So the important part with the TX weight calculation is we need to weigh the MMTX so that we're weighing it appropriately again within the context of PoW, our proof of entropy minima. And what this basically says is that each mine share has a bit weight, just like a block does. So when we mine a block, when we want to compute the entropy of the block, this first equation here, the log of k minus the hash of the block, determines the number of bits that block has in reduced entropy. When we're looking at a bit share, we use the same calculation to get this intermediate variable x. Now the problem though is when I'm thinking about comparing bit shares, I need to weigh them by their likelihood in the distribution. And so if we think about the distribution in this particular case, it's an exponential distribution, which is shown here to the right. So what I need to do is I need to proportionally weight it by its sort of likelihood in that distribution. So, for example here, if I have a 20-bit block, so to speak, so I have a 20-bit intrinsic entropy reduction in a block, I could include, say, 21-bit shares. However, 21-bit shares are not as statistically weighty as a 20-bit block. So what I need to do is I need to renormalize those bits based off how often I sort of find 1-bit shares. So the way that I do that is I divide it by where its bit value lies in the exponential distribution. So if we find a value that's like very high in this particular case, say 19 bits, 19-bit shares are effectively half as frequent as a 20-bit share. So the weight that I should assign to a 19-bit share should be half the block weight. And if we normalize against this exponential and then do the sum, we'll get that outcome, so to speak. So within a given block, within a given share, if we just normalize on the exponential, we'll get comparable bit entropies. Now, there's this other term here on the left, which is the summation of this 1/2 to the L factor. And this is also a very important factor in the system, because effectively what this is saying is once a share is generated, the longer it exists but isn't included, the less it is worth. And the reason that we have to do this is if we didn't have this sort of temporal discounting factor, what somebody could do is they could just like mine a bunch of shares, right? And then they could just like hold them for an arbitrary period of time. And then whenever they decide they really want to win a block, they can like add all of these shares to the block. They can ensure that they sort of have the highest winning entropy, and nothing here works. So this term to the left, what it's doing is it's effectively discounting in what is, again, a statistically accurate way, the age of the bit share relative to its reference versus when it's included in the block. So, if I find a bit share in block that references block 100 and I then include it in block 101, effectively that bit share will count for its full value. So that left side adjustment factor will go to 1. Now, if I wait till 102, it'll go to half. If I wait till 103, it'll go to 1/4. So on and so forth. And this is actually the right sort of entropic treatment with time. If you understand the progression of entropy, there is an assumption baked in there which has to do with assuming that we're running in a constant or a fixed difficulty setting. But over a small set of blocks, that's a fine assumption. Oh, and then the other factor here is M. So if we think about what I just wrote, this equation technically could go all the way back to Genesis, which would be incredibly expensive to compute. So the concept of M here is we just limit the depth at which we compute bit shares. So you can still add a transaction in a block after depth M, but it's basically not going to contribute to the weight of the block. So when we think about what is happening here with why miners would include transactions, there's really two pieces. There's the base fee piece, and then there's the sort of weight piece. So a mine transaction that's older than 16 blocks still has the incentive to be included because it provides the miner a base fee. It's just that bit share is no longer added or calculated in the block weight. So then the question is, does mine transaction create a cooperative outcome? And before we answer that question, we actually have to sort of go back in time a little bit and just ask ourselves, what is the TX propagation incentive that exists in current networks? And the really interesting answer to this is that it doesn't. So we've spent all these years running blockchains, and regardless if it's proof of stake or proof of work, if you have a fee-based inclusion mechanism, there is zero incentive for the miners to share or propagate those transactions. Crazy. So there's no incentive, there's no disincentive. So then the question is, why do people do it? And it's interesting, and it's also a little bit non-obvious. But in this case, sharing is not caring, sharing is bag holding. So the reason that miners share transactions with each other is because they want the value of the system to go up over time because they have stake in the system. But on an instantaneous basis, there is absolutely no incentive to share. But if they didn't share, there wouldn't be liveliness in the network. If there's not liveliness or throughput in the network, no one's going to want to use the network, and the utility is going to go to zero. So literally, the reason they share is because they have some interest in the network or the coin, and they want the value to go up. So what are the implications of MMTXs relative to our TX propagation incentives or lack thereof? The fact that MMTXs now contribute to block weight means that withholding an MMTX could be an advantage. And from a consensus standpoint, it means that potentially, if we just think about MMTXs and bit shares, we could end up having blocks that do not reflect a minor's share of hash rate. So like this is tragic. So we have no incentive to propagate, and then MMTXs create an incentive to withhold. So now we actually have like a really big problem here. So the question is there a way that we can fix it? Obviously, if I'm giving this presentation, right, a little bit of a preview is, yes, there's a way to fix it. So the way we go about this, or the way we think about it, is can we create a penalty for withholding? Then the penalty that I propose is that we add a processing delay to a TX. And the way that we can do that is using something called a symmetric delay function. And we'll go over what that means in a second, but basically the idea is there's a function that I can force everybody to run, and when they run it, it will roughly take everybody the same amount of time. So if I make TXs have to use an SDF to construct them and have to use an SDF to validate them, I can create a delay in construction and I can create a delay in verification. The implications of having that delay is that if a TX isn't propagated, the delay creates a higher orphan rate and decreases profits. So if I include a transaction as a miner that I know hasn't propagated in the network, so say I find, we go with our 20-bit block and I find a 19-bit share. I'm saying to myself, sweet, this is worth half that block weight. So if I can hold this to myself, I'm going to be the only one that is able to sort of propose this block with that kind of weight, so I'm more likely to win. However, if I add a delay, when that block is broadcasted, before everybody can validate the block, they first have to validate the transaction. Before they can validate the transaction, they have to run the SDF. So the SDF, whatever that time delay, is actually going to be a delay to processing the block, which is going to be a delay to everybody building cooperatively on that block, which means that block is going to have a higher orphan rate, and it's going to decrease the profits of the miners. If a TX is propagated, however, my orphan rate will decrease and my profits will increase. So the implication here is that we need to add an SDF into an MMTX. So instead of sharing transactions being caring, it would make sharing transactions most profitable. So an SDF creates a propagation incentive, which aligns miner profitability with cooperatively propagating transactions. So now the question, though, is what is an SDF and how does it work? The purpose of an SDF is to add a consistent delay. The way that it accomplishes this is through a sequence of hashes rather than parallelizable independent hashing. So when we talk about mining, I don't have to do hashes in sequence. I can have many threads that are independently running different nonces over different ranges. So I have independent processes. What an SDF basically says is I'm going to make you do a hash, but then the output of the hash is going to be the input of the hash again. And I'm going to have an iteration set, and I'm going to make you loop on this process until you've hit sort of this target iteration number, which corresponds to a delay time. The interesting thing here is because hashes are one-way functions, effectively the only way to compute and verify the end result is then to process from the start to the finish, which then means that everyone has that consistent delay when checking an SDF. And it's very, very trivial to create transactions in the network which would have invalid SDFs just to make sure that everyone is actually checking their SDFs. So an SDF can't be parallelized. and the rate at which it executes is effectively dependent on a single thread's clock rate. And most clock rates on most systems, certainly most competitive systems that would be running nodes, have clock rates that are somewhat similar and execution expectations on a single thread that are somewhat similar. So what does an SDF do then? It guarantees that creating and verifying a transaction require a delay, and that the time of delay is roughly equal for everybody in the system. And for small intervals, the variance is low. And when we another way to put this is an SDF creates a good lower bound on an MMTX processing delay. Now, if I have, say, like a smartphone versus a node that, a computer I'd be running a node on, obviously the smartphone, maybe it's half as fast as the node computer. But anybody that's sort of running a node computer, if they're doing it in a competitive way, the variation within the execution time of an SDF is going to be relatively tight. You might think, obviously we haven't measured it, but expectation would be that sort of your 1 sigma value is 10%. So we get a good lower bound on processing delay for an MMTX. Now, there's some tricks, though, that come along with this introduction of an SDF, which is how do we choose the delay? So what delay do we need to ensure the incentive to propagate is the dominant strategy? And to figure this out, we need to think about this in the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario is that there's only one transaction that's been mined, only one MMTX, and it has a very high bit share. So the way that we sort of guarantee that propagation incentive is that the penalty for withholding needs to be proportional to the advantage of including the bit share. And the way that we do that is we make the SDF requirement so that it is proportional to the advantage of the bit share. So to put this simply, again, if we go with our 20-bit block value that's our intrinsic, if we have a 19-bit share on, say, a 10-second block time, the requirement of the SDF to have a valid 19-bit share would potentially be 9.5 seconds, because it's only a little bit less than the 20 seconds. If it's, say, a 10-bit share, it would only be half the block expectation time for the SDF. If it's 1 bit, it's effectively going to be 0. So for, again, transactions that don't really care about ordering, they're not even going to really see this in creating a transaction or validating a transaction. But any transactions that care about ordering, the SDF that goes along with creation and the SDF that goes along with validation would end up being proportional to bit shares. And the equations on the right here are saying basically that your penalty has to equal your advantage, that the delay we can compute based off of this equation of mean expected block time and the bit share threshold we're trying to achieve, and that when we're processing a transaction, we'll effectively make sure that the SDF and the bit share is always matched. And if they're mismatched, we'll always take the minimum of the two when computing how to weight that bit share in a block. So for example, if you found a 19-bit share, but you only included a 10-bit SDF, you would only get credit for 10 bits. Or if inversely, you included, say, a 19-bit SDF with only a 10-bit share, you would get 10 bits in the block again. So as long as we sort of make sure that they're always matched and we're always sort of taking the minimum of the two, we can make sure that high bit shares, which give advantage, also have a high delay, which approaches the block time as the bit share approaches the block time. And this means that I can make it so that the penalty for withholding is always greater than the advantage for withholding, which means we can maintain the propagation incentive no matter what. So the SDF delay is chosen to make sure that the delay creates an incentive that's always effectively greater than the equivalent advantage due to the weight. So what do we need to do? So this rabbit hole was fun and deep. There's another issue with an SDF, though. An SDF needs to be measured with time. So we said that the execution time of an SDF has to do with sort of clock rates, and clock rates of threads change over time. Computers obviously get better, clock rates go up. So we need to effectively measure the performance value of this conversion factor between SDF iterations and real world time delays. And to do that, we need to create something called an SDF challenge. So what we'd like to do is when miners are mining blocks, we'd also like to force them to run this SDF challenge while they're creating the proposal for a block. We will reward them for completing more rounds. So the higher the number of rounds they can do in a block, they'll get sort of an adder. So there's an incentive to sort of participate in the SDF challenge. And what this will allow us to do is it allows us to take a network-wide sample of how fast people can compute SDFs, and then we can create a network average rate, which we call kappa, which is iterations per second. But to create this game, we need to make mining depend on the SDF. So the concept here is that if we basically take intermediate points in the SDF, we can determine what those intermediate points are based off previous kappas. We use that as an input into a function that we'd call nonce range. It would then provide the miner a valid nonces that they could work over given that block and that SDF as an input. And then they can work that range. They're going to eventually run out of nonces, and they're going to be forced again to do the next sort of step in the iteration of the SDF. And then that will provide them a new nonce range. So it forces them to do an SDF. It forces them to iterate an SDF. And then the way we're forcing that is because when a block is then proposed, one of the requirements when we check the nonce is that not only does it meet the difficulty threshold, but the nonce that was used to meet the difficulty threshold is also in the nonce range that's output by the SDF at the given SDF iteration interval. So fun times. So the SDF challenge allows determination of kappa, which would have this units of iterations per second, which allows us to accurately measure the real world sort of delay implications on including the SDF at any given point in time in the network. And then it allows us to calculate the required iterations in proportional to bit shares when they're going into blocks. So what does this mean in terms of MEV itself? The cool part here is that when we do work-bound ordering, we have a finite time to sort of front run. So if we go back to our example of Alice and Bob, Alice broadcasts her transactions. If I set up this game wherein I include transactions in the weighting of blocks, I create an SDF which forces people to propagate those transactions. I'm weighting them in such a way that they're deprecated with staleness of inclusion. Everybody will want to include every possible transaction they care as fast as they can. So what this means is that Bob now has a very finite time interval once he sees Alice's transaction to create a new transaction, to have to run an SDF to make that transaction valid, to then sign it, to run the SDF, then he has to mine it, and it has to be better than Alice's, and then he has to sign it. And he has to do that before the network is incentivized to include Alice's transaction. So Bob here is pretty much screwed at this point. For a big enough MEV value, he still has a non-zero opportunity of success. But like his likelihood of success keeps going down and down and down. So at some point, either he could still win, or his expected return for participating is effectively going to be so low that he's not even going to do it. And then what's going to end up happening is the only people that will end up mining transactions are those that are wanting to protect those transactions, and the only transactions that will be MEVable are going to be the ones that aren't mined. So then Bob's going to ignore Alice's transaction because he knows that he can't have a positive expectation of return in trying to MEV that transaction. He's going to go to Karen's transaction, who has a slip and didn't put work shares on it, And instead, he's going to know that that has a positive outcome, and he's going to front run Karen's transaction because he can't front run Alice's profitably. But because we know Bob still exists, Alice is highly incentivized to provide those work shares. And the interesting piece is that bit share, one, has an expectation value of getting a block. So it's worth something to Alice. And the amount of money that she's putting into the bit share is only going to be a fraction of the amount of money that she would lose potentially from getting MEV'd. So any rational actor in the system would perform the bit shares either by themselves, creating a decentralization incentive, or through a market where they give it to the miners to do it for them. So the implications here, though, is transactions have MEV, or which have MEV should have high shares. And MEV exploiters will spend their potential profits now on hashing. So, that's the other cool piece here, is that MEV is now contributing or subsidizing chain security. If Bob is doing it or Alice is doing it, it doesn't matter. It's still paying for chain security. And there's a couple cool implications of that. One of which is that the MEV itself is going to have proportionality to the amount of the transaction. And the amount that you have to pay in bit shares will be proportional to the amount of MEV. So what that means then is that the revenue that's generated now by the chain to secure the chain is no longer proportional to bytes, independent of transaction value, but for transactions which have a MEVable opportunity, the chain is actually getting remunerated on a percentage basis. And if we think about how much money is derived from both DeFi and MEV, you can actually subsidize or have maybe 10x the security revenue because of this proposal than you would get just overpaying for bytes for inclusion. So, in terms of security, this is like a great realization because it creates sort of this new revenue model, right? So the chain benefits, the users benefit because their sort of cost to executing MEVable transactions, is maybe 1/10 of what it was. So they kind of know their cost upfront and a priori. And then the other thing that's also cool about this is this provides DDoS protection on transaction propagation in the network. So that's another cool piece about sort of mal-designed processes in current blockchain systems is right now on transaction propagation, clients basically just arbitrarily decide kind of what transactions they want to propagate, and they also decide kind of what their sort of fee minimum is. But that's super arbitrary based on sort of how one miner wants to interact with the network versus another. But with this system, if you wanted to, you could actually have an objectively set propagation minima for a bit share. So then people can't sort of spam the transactions for free. They actually have to create a share, and if they don't have the right share value, the transactions don't even propagate. So it actually adds DDoS protection to the network and the mempool. With MMTXs, both time and hash, you're time and hash bound when reordering transactions. And so there's finally one really interesting thing that this all does, which is this creates a more secure consensus mechanism. So, and I'm calling this beating Nakamoto, and mine transactions effectively add memory to a sampled process, which improves security. So this was one of actually the really counterintuitive things when we were developing the security proof from PoW that came up. And maybe it's obvious, if you're thinking about Poisson processes, but it's certainly counterintuitive relative to, I think, most people's intuitions of how work-based blockchains progress. And I'll give the example. So in a work-based chain, if I have two blocks, A and B, I have a fork. Most people would say, like, during this time of the fork, before this fork is resolved, half the hash rate is here, half the hash rate is there. So the progression of the chain has effectively fallen in half. Now, the interesting thing here is that's not actually true. Because when I add the two Poissons for the A tip and the B tip together, as everybody's hashing on either side, the expectation in aggregate is still one block time. So block C that builds on A or B will still be found, in the average block expectation time. So the growth rate hasn't actually been negatively impacted. And, that's kind of weird because we think, when forks happen, we're sort of paying for hash until the fork goes away. What actually happened here is your penalty for hash, because of how this process is set up, is taken when the fork happened. So it's the delay in propagation that caused B to be created because B wasn't aware of A. But that delta was your penalty. But the penalty to resolution in a memoryless process doesn't exist. So that's interesting. But then it gets a little bit more meta. And let's say I have the same system and I have A and B. If I were God, right, and I can measure every hash that's done in the system rather than taking a sample of hashes, i.e. samples above a threshold, I could say I will count every hash by every person that's done. I'm going to collect all 100 petahashes together, and I'm going to validate every single one of them. Completely untenable practically, but let's say I did it. In that exact same scenario where I'm basically saying I'm going to count every hash, and then I'm only going to make a block when I get accumulation of commitments on A or B that add up to the next threshold. In that exact same example, we have now halved the network progression rate because I now have a process that has memory. Okay? And so the interesting implication here is when we do merge mine transactions, we're creating memory. And that memory allows us to sample the process more accurately. And the implication of that is that we can beat Nakamoto. So, to give an overview of what that is, if we look at current work-based systems and consensus, PoW is only secure, practically, to a 1/3 attacker. Colloquially, people refer to a 51% attack, but the fact that the honest majority has a propagation delay delta and the attacker is assumed to not have a propagation delay, it practically goes down to 1/3 rather than 50%. In that same context, if we look at PoW, in our analysis of PoW, we can improve that security threshold to 2/5. So 40% is better than 33%. However, if we do PoW with MMTXs, I know we can get above 1/2, and we could potentially go to 9/10. So not only can we beat Nakamoto, we can beat the shit out of Nakamoto. And this is also really cool here too, because every percent I get over 51% is technically like a multiplier in the security budget. So if we can practically get to 9/10, there's another 10x in the security budget. So MMTXs have added 10x because they're going to get revenue from MEV, and then they're also going to add another 10x because of the resilience to an attacker being higher than 50%. So this is pretty crazy stuff. So then what's sort of the downside of it? So the limit to PoW with MMTX security is that if I were to sort of try to make our attack resilience approach 99%, it would preclude late joining clients from entering the network, and it would potentially increase the likelihood of network partitions. But there's some balance here that's above 50% and below 1 where optimality lies. So this is a really cool outcome that I figured out in the last week, and this is something we're now working on proving. So with that, I'll take questions.
Sure. She asks a more generic question, but if collected fees do not suffice in a low subsidy environment, a form of MEV could serve as a new incentive for miners to continue processing blocks and securing the network. So SDFs is our solution, right?
Just read it back to me one more time. I think that's a good question. I need one more go of it.
For sure. So Keisha was asking a more generic question. She says, if collected fees do not suffice in a low subsidy environment, a form of MEV could serve as a new incentive for miners to continue processing blocks and securing the network. So SDFs is our solution, correct?
Yeah, so MEV adds an independent incentive to mine outside of byte-based transaction fees, as well as block subsidies. True statements.
Cool. And then we've got another question that says, could the SDF challenge delay block production time? Is basically that question.
Absolutely great question. So if the transactions are pre-propagated, people can validate the transaction prior to needing to process a block. So, right, once I receive a transaction, I can validate the SDF portion of it. So I can sort of maintain the same rate. It's just I would never want to include a transaction that I haven't yet validated, so that the interval hasn't elapsed, and I don't think it's like network propagated yet. So, but the natural outcome is that if people just validate the SDF portion of the transaction when they get the transaction, like that is the outcome. They must validate it and it must propagate it prior to them including it, right? So that process is like independent of sort of the block like increment process. And the incentive here is to pre-propagate transactions and then only include transactions that are pre-propagated. So by the time I'm actually putting transactions into a block, I have been able to validate the SDF. I assume everybody else has been able to validate the SDF, and the SDF is propagated. So then when that block is found, it will only include transactions which have already been validated, and the SDF portion. So there's no additional time at finding the block due to the SDF. The only time that happens is if somebody includes a transaction that wasn't pre-propagated. If they include a transaction that's pre-propagated, right, that's like the whole penalty idea. So if I sort of have a private block, or I'm mining and I have this big bit share transaction that's worth 19 bits in our 20-bit block, and my block's now, got 50% more weight than everybody else's because of that share, when I broadcast that block, nobody knew about that TX. So now they're going to have to wait 9.5 seconds to process before they can validate that TX and decide, okay, that was a valid block, I should work on it. So what we've done there is we've matched or made sure that the penalty of including a non-pre-propagated, non-validated transaction is always necessarily higher than the reward from the bit share.
And then I think there was a clarification.
Sorry. So the other point here too is to do this at high rates, the system is going to need a GPU. So going forward at some point, nodes will need a GPU to efficiently keep up with producing blocks. That's actually required for more than just MMTXs. That's also going to be required for efficiently doing high volumes of cross-chain transactions. So that requirement is kind of going to get baked in at some point. But with a GPU, if we say take a modern GPU, it has 16,000 threads, let's say. And each one of those threads can independently be doing the hashing function to be validating, a set of transactions. If we're running, say, at 4,000 TPS in a 9-shard system, you're running 400 TPS per shard. We're running like 4,000-ish transactions in a block. You will be able to validate with your GPU threads in your node 4 times as many transactions that are going into the block. So you're technically validating at 4 times real-time rate. And having that surplus of continuous validation in the thread count is actually sort of like the security parameter of allowing late joining clients, but not being easily subjected to long range reordering attacks. So like that choice for honest nodes in terms of like how many threads they're running relative to the number of TXs in a block is actually a decision that they have to make to try to optimize their efficiency in syncing versus their efficiency or their ability to be eclipsed, if that makes sense. So like their susceptibility to a private mining attack has to do with the fact that that SDF takes time to process. Now, if they had like 20 GPUs and they could process this at like 1,000x real-time rate, they would be more susceptible to an attacker. But an honest node doesn't want to make themselves susceptible to an attacker. So they're going to choose like a rational value, which is when I am synced, or I think I'm synced, I will only sort of have this 4x margin, which will optimize my sort of resilience to a private mining attack while also allowing me to not partition from the network. So it's this sort of like market determined magic number that somehow varies with block size.
Okay. And I'll kind of delve into that a little bit more here in a sec, but there's some follow-up questions on the SDF challenge stuff. So kind of following up on the last one, the person who asked it was saying that their question is related to the SDF challenge done on the block by the miners, not on the individual transactions.
Yeah, so basically to force the miner to do the challenge, we have to make the SDF hash part of the header. And then we will make it so that the valid range of nonces that can go with that seal hash are determined by the current step in the SDF. So maybe every step in an SDF, you do every, say, I don't know, 1024 hashes. Again, you can adjust what that interval is by your current kappa. But then based off that interval point, you'll be able to calculate deterministic set of nonce ranges that maybe is like 1 million nonces. And then once you sort of run out of that range of nonces, you're going to have to go to the next step in the SDF, which basically forces the miner to update their block and also timely compute their SDF.
Okay. And then to kind of continue following up on that, would this SDF also increase the fork resolution time of the chain?
So the net outcome of this should be there's not only no increase to processing time of a block. For propagated transactions, we should be able to pre-compute most of our blocks most of the time. So total time between a block being broadcasted and then building on that block from a processing standpoint should go to 0. Sorry, the question one more time. There's one other point.
Essentially, we're asking is if the SDF challenge on the block would also increase fork time.
Oh, yeah. So,
or like fork resolution time, sorry.
Yeah. No, so fork resolution time will actually be much, much better. So the reason that this is interesting is because you're adding memory to the process. When I add memory to the process, I'm lowering the variance of the measurement, which dramatically increases my convergence. So again, like we haven't gone through the math, but basically like everybody's going to agree after a block is like what's going to end up happening. I don't think it's possible to really get blocks past depth 1 anymore, like forks past depth 1. We have to rigorously go through it all, but yeah, like yeah. It's going to be as fast as the physical limits are possible, is the implication. Yeah.
And then kind of a last personal question clarification that I'd like to ask is, what do you think the ramifications of requiring your node clients to run GPUs are in terms of decentralization and just participation in the network with the higher barrier to entry?
Yeah, so there's a couple reasons we need them. Like I said, with the cross-chain transactions, they kind of become necessary. So we that is sort of requiring them. The MMTXs also require them. The other thing that's interesting, though, is in a blockchain, there's actually a number of processes that exist that are very graph-like. And those processes take the majority of CPU time. So having GPUs not only should get you better throughput over the hierarchy, it will not only create finalization times and depths that are only limited by the physics of the measurement. We, in optimization of our node software, we think that there's very easily a 10x improvement in performance of the nodes, if not 100x, that would be achieved by having and exploiting a GPU. So net, if you're trying to build money and we're trying to do it with the fewest number of shards with the highest throughput, the trade-off bound, it's an obvious choice. GPUs, if you're going to participate, you're going to mine, you're going to have a GPU anyway. So if you have one on your computer, and we can use that for some of the node validation process, and we can take a single node's throughput from, say, 400 TPS to 4,000 TPS, it doesn't even seem like this is a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think that is it as far as questions go. Just wanted to say thanks for kind of delving into the depths of merge mine transactions, SDFs, and how we actually beat Nakamoto here at Quai. So let me just add a link for everybody. So if people, it sounds like a couple of people do actually understand what I'm saying. If they have ideas or want to make comments, if you go to it's Quai-network/Kips or Quips. So if people have want to review, want to dig in, want to make commentary, more eyes, more analysis, certainly the better. Perfect. Thanks for dropping that in the chat, Max. Everybody, we recommend going and checking that out, contributing if you have the will to. But any kind of closing stuff from you, Dr. K?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'll give one closing thought here. I think that PoW put us on a path that actually finally gets us to understanding what consensus is. And the interesting thing is I think it's actually really, really simple. Work-based consensus is the concept of measuring a process. So if I just think about this as an engineer, or you just think about it as a statistician, however you want to call it, what we're trying to do is we're trying to measure the contribution of hashes to the system. So we have a physical process and we have a sampling requirement. So as an engineer's point of view, right, if I have a physical process and I take a sample, any single sample is going to have variance. That makes sense. And really, that's kind of what PoW was saying to us. What is also being said to us is that the more samples we can take, the better our measurement. Like that's the implication. So when it comes down to consensus in work-based systems, if you really want to understand it, it's just how do I sample a thing efficiently so that I have low measurement error due to variance? That's all it is, which is absolutely crazy because you can refine all of this crazy math and distributions on these, the outcomes of, a random oracle and like all this very esoteric mathematical ideas to just thinking about it as an engineer or a statistician trying to sample a population and understand the variance of the measurement. That's all this is, actually, I think. So in some ways, I think I finally understood what this is in consensus. And I would argue it is the most accurate reflection of what the problem is, and it's actually very simple to understand in some ways. Now, you still have to design a consensus system around it and do all that fun stuff, but framing the problem in that viewpoint, I think, makes it very, very understandable.
Well, I think also kind of goes along with the kind of age-old thought that the best solution is always the simplest. And while the kind of math behind the solution may not be the simplest, the framing, it's nice when it kind of all collapses down to one key thought or idea like that.
Yeah, well, yeah. So think about this. So take that mind view, right? And then let's talk about Bitcoin. So if we understand that we're trying to accurately measure a process, and then I said the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to take one sample every 10 minutes on a process that any individual is executing a million times a second. Would you think that's a good solution, Judy?
Generally speaking, no. I think you're missing a lot of the data there.
It's a terrible solution, right? So then you would say, well, if I'm trying to run this, sample this process that's running so many samples per second, like I should probably have a higher number of samples. And like the higher number of samples, the closer I'm going to be accurately reflecting the process.
Yep.
Right? Anyway, like that framing almost makes the problem trivial in some ways in terms of like, what are you supposed to do? So anyway, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, on that note, I think we're probably going to close this down. I want to just say thank you for everybody coming out and hanging out and paying attention to Dr. K's presentation. We appreciate you guys asking the quality questions that we've seen in chat and just interacting with us kind of on a more technical level about some of these more complicated topics. So stick around. I know we have office hours tomorrow, as well as I think we'll have more of these university calls coming up soon. So.
Next week, we're going to do a recitation.
Oh, there we go.
So a recitation for everybody, if you don't know, is going to basically be off weeks with the university calls. And that will be the time that it's just like open-ended, sort of just like a recitation. And sort of the structure of it will be, if people have questions about last week's call, those things will go first. Then sort of just general technical questions after that. And then just time allowing, maybe just hanging out and chatting after that.
Yeah.
So.
No, absolutely. I think we've seen a pretty decent demand from some of the community to kind of have those more one-on-one conversations with you about some of the more complex technical topics. So I think that'll be kind of a great avenue for that to occur.
Well, cool, guys. Appreciate everyone coming out.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. We'll see you guys shortly and next week.